All right, so I have been taking a different process this year, and I started with Virgo on the first holy night, the evening of the birth with the pregnant virgin. And so this fourth night, I'm actually opposite you in the zodiac, Hazel, where you are in Sagittarius, I'm in Gemini. So it works pretty synchronistically. So I don't think that we'll have a problem there, but I just want to say that ahead of time for everybody that might be confused about the order that this is going to happen. But first and foremost, what I wanted to show is this image this is from the Notre Dame of Fourvière at Lyon in France. And this is a detail of the Third Ecumenical Council that happened at Ephesus in the early 5th century that has to do with a decision that was made about the Virgin Mary. And there was a confrontation between two sides where one wanted to claim that she was Christokos, or the birth giver of the Christ, but the decision was made that she was actually Theokotos, the birth giver of God. And this seems to happen simultaneous to the time when the birth mysteries just begin to be celebrated. Rudolf Steiner gives us the indication that it isn't until about the 4th century that the birth mysteries of the Christ child are celebrated. Prior to that time, it was the baptism that was the most important. So I just wanted to point that out as we begin to take this journey, that one way to imagine the 12 days and 13 nights is as though it's bookended by both the Annunciation to the Magi that the birth has taken place around the eve of Christmas, and then the arrival of the kings sometime later. We could imagine 12 days or 13 days later. It doesn't give an exact date in the biblical account, but that this takes us across this threshold from Christmas Eve to Epiphany, where Epiphany used to be associated with the baptism of the Christ. Oftentimes now it's associated with the visitation of the kings to the birth of the Christ child. And so this switch seems to take place around the 4th century. So I just wanted to give that kind of as a framework for what I intend to talk about tonight. And also to cite, I'm not going to read this whole screen, but for those who are listening on the phone, I've got up on the screen right now a quote from Rudolf Steiner's Yuletide lecture, which he actually gave on December 27th back in 1910. And he gives a beautiful indication here about something that can enrich our understanding about what's happening in the traditional celebrations that happened around Christmas time. And he gives a beautiful description of the Christmas plays, starting with the Paradise play that would happen on the 24th of December, which was the festival of Adam and Eve, and that would be then followed by the play celebrating the birth of the Christ child on Christmas Day. And that how this transition from Christmas Eve and the Paradise to Christmas Day and the birth of the Christ child is as though a movement from the Eve, the mother of humanity, to the Ave, or specifically the Ave Maria, who is the mother then of the Christ child, or as Theokotos, the mother of God. And so this transition from Eva to Ave is a sublime mystery that's happening and sounding out through this time. And although we oftentimes think of Eve as indicating that it is the evening before something, I like to think that the eves that occur during this time of year have something to do with this transition from the Eva to the Ave. And so there's 3 opportunities that arise during the Holy Nights where we can move through this encounter with something that is a preparation for and then a fulfillment of. And I imagine them as Christmas Eve, which is the first Holy Night from December 24th to December 25th, then New Year's Eve from December 31st to January 1st, and then 12th night, which is the Eve of Epiphany from January 5th to January 6th. And each one of these calls, or this movement from the Eva to the Ave, can be imagined as a call. And then you can apply it to things that come in 3s. And there are lots of things that show up in anthroposophy and in the world that have this rhythm and harmony with the number 3. So this comes from the Yuletide lecture that Rudolf Steiner gave, and I've cited it on the slide there, but if anybody wants a reference to that, that can be shared afterward. All right, so as I said, the first Eve is Christmas Eve, then we have New Year's Eve, then we have the Eve of Epiphany. Another thing that comes in 3s when Rudolf Steiner is describing the worldview as described by anthroposophy, he talks about post the Atlantean epics. So what happens after the great catastrophe at Atlantis, and then how there are these post-Atlantean epics in which we find ourselves. The first of which he refers to as the ancient Indian epic. And he likens the three gifts that are brought by the kings to the Christ child to these epics. And he says that the frankincense that is brought by one of the kings actually represents the culmination of the wisdom that derives from the ancient Indian epic. And that the gold that is brought is actually the highest representation of what's coming out of the ancient Persian epic. And the myrrh then represents what comes from the Egypto-Chaldean epic. And so these three gifts that are brought by the three kings to the birth of the Christ child are actually an expression of the highest understanding of the incarnation of the Christ that comes from the three epics prior to that moment when the Christ actually incarnates. And so these three gifts then, or these three epics, or these three eves, are a preparation then as a call to the human soul to awaken, that something is about to take place. And we find this in the foundation stone meditation. In the first three panels, each one of them is a call to the human soul. And then after these three calls, after these three epics, you could say after these three visitations of the kings, after the three eves through the holy nights, we come to a turning point. So what we're looking at right now, as I shared earlier, on this fourth night, if you begin on Christmas Eve with the birth of the Christ child, the pregnant virgin having given birth, the second night would have been Leo, the third night Cancer, and then now the fourth night is Gemini. And so on the left, we have an image of the original calendar of the soul and the way it was printed with the imagination created by Ima von Eckertstein at the direction of Rudolf Steiner. And then on the right is an image of the glass etching that was created by Margot Rossler in the 1950s, showing the same imagination. And this, for me, corresponds to the fourth night with Gemini. And at the bottom, there is a glyph, the traditional glyph for Gemini. So what we see here seems to represent the twofold nature, the twins. Gemini is the twins. And in the traditional glyph, you have these two upright lines, they're vertical lines bounded on either end. It's top and the bottom by horizontal lines. And that just seems to represent the twins. And when you look at the constellation of Gemini in the night sky, you see that the stars line up and they almost look exactly like twins. But the description that Margot Rossler gives to the Gemini image is that it's meant to depict the human being before and after this sublime moment of summer solstice. In the sidereal zodiac, the sun reaches the moment where it's highest above the celestial equator when it's in front of the stars of Gemini. And so you can imagine on the left-hand side, that kind of elemental looking being that both Ima von Eckertstein and Margot Rossler created, or the left line in the traditional glyph of Gemini, is actually, it represents the human being before this moment where there's a sacred opening that happens at solstice. And what the human being would carry out into the spiritual cosmos is met by the hierarchy, is met by the sun at its highest place, and is as though fructified for then bearing back toward the earth, which then is the task of the human being on the right-hand side of this imagination. So it's not just one being two ways, it's the human being before and the human being after this moment of this sublime moment of sun at its highest hour. So this is actually happening at the exact opposite time of year from right now. We've just had the sun come to its lowest place, its furthest place further south below the celestial equator. And so it's as though that being on the right of the Gemini imagination has now carried this sun-imbued seed all the way to the earth, and the earth is as though open, but held in this embrace of the stars. Whereas at the summer moment, it's the sun that is really kind of filling the space. But it's not just this twofold nature where it's a before and an after. Something really wonderful actually happens in this, where you can imagine that the human being is awake and comes to this threshold, and the moment of encountering the glory of that sun being is not a moment that it's easy to stay awake to. And so it's almost as though you could say that we move across this threshold and we go to sleep. Rudolf Steiner, when he describes how reviewing the life or looking through history, that oftentimes we look in a linear way and forget the fact that we go across the threshold into sleep every night, and that there is a death that happens at the end of each life, and that usually isn't regarded as part of the review of the biography. But in the Gemini mystery, what you can see, it's as though you've got this being on the left-hand side, or the line in the traditional glyph is actually the first threshold that you cross when you're awake and you're falling into sleep. And then that space between the two beings, or between the two lines, that's where you're in sleep. And then the being on the right represents crossing the threshold back into wakefulness. And this is really, really sacred to pay attention to, because what Rudolf Steiner describes is that what happens when we're falling asleep is that if we're able to sustain consciousness while the physical body goes to sleep, that we can have an encounter with the spiritual world. And that this is where we bring the fruits of our day into that realm. And there, then, in sleep, we meet the genius of our being. And then before we awaken, we can receive a message that we then can carry back into wakefulness. So there's something really wonderful that's going on in this Gemini moment, where you come from wakefulness across the threshold into sleeping, and then back across the threshold into wakefulness. And this shows up in other areas. One of the places where I think it's most remarkable and magnificent is in the painting by Raphael of the Transfiguration, where you can imagine that Elijah, the being that is to the left, but on the right of the Christ being, is that first kind of guardian that we cross past as we are falling into sleep. And there's the Christ being bounded on the right side by Moses. And beneath him are James and John and Peter. And they're asleep. They can't look. They can't bear that level of consciousness. So I imagine this as one way to give expression to what's happening in that Gemini time of year, or at that point, at the fourth stage. We're on the fourth night, but at the fourth epoch, when this turn takes place, we've come across the threshold, a turn has happened, and we will emerge from that threshold. But it's not easy to bear consciousness at that moment. And so this image actually also by Raphael depicts what's happening for those who you would imagine would be most prepared for that moment. Also, it's interesting to note that we're coming up to the 500th anniversary of the death of Raphael during the Holy Week in 2020. This Transfiguration was the last painting that he painted, and it was actually at the foot of his bed when he died. So it's a powerful imagination, and you can imagine that for 500 years, this has been kind of sounding through the centuries toward us. And I'm not saying that it's only about Gemini. There's many, many mysteries going on here, but it's a very interesting configuration. Just the top half of this particular painting, to imagine that the Christ being there fully imbued with the sun is brighter than what the apostles can bear at that moment. It's almost like Emily Dickinson says, the truth must dazzle gradually, or every man be blind. So in this moment, they can't bear the greatness of the truth of what's being revealed. So something to imagine each day as we go through the holy nights and every day of the year, to take a moment to remember that each night I will be asleep, and that I could take some of this wakefulness into that sleep, and perhaps in that sleep come to that moment where I remembered that I would be asleep while I was awake, to build this relationship across that threshold as a spiritual practice. All right, so also this is an image that it's a drawing of Dante from his Divine Comedy in the canticle called Paradise, where he is ascending into the 8th heaven, which is the heaven of the fixed stars. And he enters this region at Gemini. And some translators say that he did that because he was born when the sun was in Gemini. There's really something quite remarkable that's going on in this region. Now, in our time, the sun comes to its solstice moment in Gemini, but it seems to have this quality for Dante of representing the fact that he's crossed over a threshold from the human physical world into the spiritual world. And the first thing that Beatrice tells him to do when they cross into this 8th sphere of the heaven is to look back toward the earth. And the earth at that moment, if he's in the starry region of Gemini looking toward the earth, he would see the earth embraced by the region of Sagittarius. And so the fascinating thing about this is that he's kind of giving expression to a view of our planetary system and even the universe as it was understood in the 13th and 14th century that comes from Aristotle, and also was propounded by Thomas Aquinas, whom he met in the sun sphere. And so this image that I'm showing, it shows Dante and Beatrice with Thomas Aquinas and Albertus Magnus, and it's a fascinating set of people that he meets in the sun sphere. If you haven't read the Divine Comedy, I highly recommend it, because it's a lot of what we learn in anthroposophy here in the 21st century is also deeply rooted and revealed through the Divine Comedy. Okay. So this image is from Guy Ottewell. For those of you that are on the phone, what it's showing is the path of the planets on the, that path is called the ecliptic, because that's where eclipses happen. And the path of the ecliptic crosses over the Milky Way in the region of Gemini. So you'll see where it says Castor and Pollux there. And so this is, I think, one of the reasons that Dante had his ascension into the 8th sphere of the fixed stars at Gemini, because that's where it crosses the Milky Way. And then on the opposite side, because the Milky Way is going around us in a circle, it looks to us like we're at the center of it. On the other side, looking towards Sagittarius, is the other place where the Milky Way crosses the ecliptic. And so when we're looking into Sagittarius, we're actually looking toward the center of the Milky Way galaxy. I don't know that in Dante's time they would have known that, but you can, when you look into the sky, see that that region of Milky Way stars in Sagittarius is by far the most heavily populated region of stars in the night sky. And so when they're moving through the Inferno in the Divine Comedy, Dante is being led by Virgil down to the center of the earth, and they ultimately have to climb down the body of Lucifer. And when they get to the region of the thigh, they turn and make an ascent. And so the thigh, of course, and Dante would have known this, representing the Sagittarius region of the human form. And so when Dante is in the 8th sphere of the heaven in Gemini, looking back toward the earth in Sagittarius, it also has this added layer of understanding that deep into the earth is where Lucifer has been driven once he falls from the grace of God. So this is kind of defined for Dante by the place where the ecliptic crosses the Milky Way. And so this embrace of the cycle of the years, we're coming up to Gemini in the summer solstice, we go across the Milky Way, and then we take this in-breath back toward winter solstice, we cross over the Milky Way again at this time of year. So we are now, if you were on the opposite side of the earth from the sun, looking back toward the earth at this time, you would see us in front of Sagittarius stars, in front of that deepest, thickest, richest part of the Milky Way. If you were on the sun, looking toward the earth, you would see beyond us the stars of Gemini, but also right bounded by the Milky Way. So this is a marvelous mystery that happens on this 4th night when you're turning through the cycle of the zodiac, beginning at a certain point. So that turn that takes place at the solstice moments. Okay, so this is a picture now of the December evening sky that comes from Michigan State University Abrams Planetarium. And although they don't show the Milky Way there, why I wanted to show this is so that you could see Gemini is rising up in the east, and it's part of that winter circle of stars. It's very bright right now. And also you can see the star cluster Pleiades, which marks the shoulder region of the constellation Taurus the Bull, is just starting to come to its highest place in the evening sky. In the Native American tradition that belongs to the Great Lakes region, there is a tale about how the indigenous peoples are to determine the ceremony for honoring the new year that comes. And this is to happen, that ceremony is to happen when 5 sleeps after the new moon, when Pleiades is highest. So this year it just so happens that that event falls, or that ceremony would be observed in harmony with what's we have as New Year's in the Gregorian calendar, because we had a new moon, well, at least here in the Eastern time zone, it happened on the 26th. It was just after midnight, so the further west you went, it was probably still on the 25th. But on the 26th, there was new moon, so 5 sleeps later would get us to the 31st of December. Pleiades is highest up in the sky, and then that's the trigger for celebrating the new year. Now, the brightest star in the cluster of Pleiades has the name Alcyon, which means foundation stone. So when we couple with this with the fact that Rudolf Steiner gave the foundation stone as a meditation during the Christmas conference, then you can see that he's doing this as the foundation stone itself is highest up in the sky. So a literal speaking to the stars that's taking place during that Christmas conference. Okay, so now to get back to this 3 eves, or these 3 calls, or these 3 births that take place during the Holy Nights. And so I wanted to link it to the foundation stone meditation. So the first call to the human soul, thou livest in the limbs. And the second call, O human soul, thou livest in the beat of heart and lung. And the third call, human soul, thou livest in the resting head. And I do imagine these in relationship to the 3 preceding epics. So we have the ancient Persian, the ancient Indian, ancient Persian, Egypto-Chaldean. Then we get to the 4th epic where a turn takes place. And in the structure of the foundation stone meditation, we have these 3 calls and then the turn. Okay, so I also, in trying to imagine, when you ask yourself the question, why Rudolf Steiner was the foundation stone itself a dodecahedron. So a dodecahedron is a geometric form that has 12 sides, and each side is a pentagon, or a 5-sided flat surface. And trying to understand how this stone, it was actually a double dodecahedron that was laid into the earth in September of 1913. How does this stone become a meditation? Does the form and actual structure of that stone matter to the meditation? So one way that I've imagined it is that in the first panel, this call to the human soul is described as coming from the heights to the depths. So imagine this as a line starting at the top, drawing down to the bottom. The second call, thou livest in the beat of heart and lung, describes the encircling round. And so we imagine this as going across the center there. And then the third call, thou livest in the resting head. This is described as resounding, echoing from the depths back to the heights. Okay. So you see that we end up with this kind of, these 3 lines making a form that actually sets up the structure. So from the heights to the depths in the encircling round, from the depths to the heights, if you connected those points, then you end up with the pentagram or the pentagon. And so this is how you arrive at, this is one way. I'm not saying that this is what Rudolf Steiner is doing, but this is me in a very cumbersome way, trying to imagine, does the form of the stone itself matter to the form of the meditation? And this is what I have arrived at, that there's these 3 calls that set up these 5 points that give us this pentagon that then shows us the form of the human being, especially as it's just described by Leonardo da Vinci in his drawing of the Vitruvian Man. So again, we have this, for those of you that can't see the screen that are just on a phone, so I'm just showing the picture of a pentagon with a pentagram inside of it so that you can see the 5 points. And then also an image of a dodecahedron, which is a 12-sided object, 12 flat sides, and each surface is a pentagon. Okay, so after we get these 3 calls that kind of set up this form that supports the human being, then the 4th panel happens, where what is described is the incarnation of the Christ being. So we move through these 3 epics, we hear these 3 calls. You could say we move through these 3 eves that happen during the Holy Night's time, which is surrounding the birth of the Christ child. But then moving through the year, we come to the mystery of the mysteries of baptism, the mystery of the Golgotha that happens with the crucifixion and the resurrection and the ascension, and this all indicating that a turning point is now upon us, that something has entered into the stream of earthly humanity and now a turn will take place. And so this shows up as the 4th panel, 4th epic in the rounds of earthly evolution after the Atlantean catastrophe. And then we get to what I would call the 5th panel, when for the first time in the foundation stone meditation, the human being actually speaks. The first 3 calls come from the spiritual world toward the human being. Then it's placed in time with the 4th panel, where the turn takes place. And then in the 5th panel, as in the 5th post-Atlantean epic, now the human being speaks. And so this is a demonstration of what I think Rudolf Steiner meant when the year before the Christmas conference, he gives a verse to Marie Steiner that is pretty well known called "The stars spoke once to human beings. It is world destiny that they are silent now. To be aware of this silence can be pain for earthly humanity, but in the deepening silence there grows and there ripens what human beings speak to the stars. To be aware of this speaking can become strength for spirit man." And so then 1 year later, he gives an example of here human being is how you speak to the stars. And what the human being would say is, "O light divine, O Son of Christ, warm thou our hearts, enlighten thou our heads." So this is in answer to the three calls: human soul, thou livest in the limbs; human soul, thou livest in the beat of heart and lung; human soul, thou livest in the resting head. So these three calls sounding out through the course of human evolution, the turning point with the incarnation of the Christ, and then the fifth post-Atlantean epoch when the human being speaks in return. So actually 5 panels. I oftentimes will hear the foundation stone referred to in 4 panels, and the last 2 panels are put into 1, but I think it doesn't do it justice, especially if you're trying to figure out why is the dodecahedron the form that the foundation stone is given as a stone itself. All right, so also to belabor this point about the 3s, in the original calendar of the soul, there was a very interesting image that occurred 3 times in the front, at the end, and then somewhere in the middle. In the copy of the calendar of the soul that I have, this page was removed. So I'm not quite sure where it appeared in there, but it's also a 3-fold image. So it shows the Christ being released from the spiritual world. And then at the second stage of this image, the Christ being uniting with the earthly world. And then from the earth, this Christ being is expanding into the surrounding world, so that this surrounding world is kind of drenched with the spirit sun, as is the earth. So all of it permeated by this gift of the sun being that has been released from the spiritual world and has fully and deeply united with the earth. So one of the things that I have done during this Holy Nights then, to align with this idea that there are 3 eves or 3 potential opportunities for birth, is to deconstruct this image and recreate it. So that on the first eve, Christmas Eve, the birth of the Christ child kind of indicated by this descent or this releasing of the Christ from the spiritual world in the form of the dove. And then on on New Year's Eve, the second eve, would be this imagination that now there is a deep union with the earth. And then on the eve of the 12th night, so eve of Epiphany, then this kind of sun imbuing the earth and the surrounding world, and that this gives a foundation for the human being to stand and then speak into the spiritual world. Another way to, another thing to have in the backdrop of this is 3 significant questions, I think, that are important when we try to do the year review. Doing the yearly review at this time of year is really not just about trying to understand my own biography as much as it is trying to understand or encounter the waking and sleeping of spiritual beings in the cycle of the year. So the calendar of the soul is described by Rudolf Steiner as something that will support this capacity in the human being to become aware of the working of the spiritual world. So the first question that I have been asking as I do the review is it possible for me to become aware of what was my destiny in 2019? And the weaving of the destiny is something that is taken up by the 3rd hierarchy, the hierarchy of the angels, the archangels, and the archi. So destiny questions have to do with that working with the 3rd hierarchy. And then the second question would be what experience or where in my experiences in 2019 might I have known the consequences of my activity. And the just consequences of one's earthly deeds are the substance that is taken up by the 2nd hierarchy, particularly after death. And then the third question, what are the honest creations that I can take with me from this experience of my destiny and the consequences of my activity in this year into the new year? And the honest creations, not only of our day-to-day, of the cycle of our year, but as a gesture of the entire life, is what's taken up by the 1st hierarchy after death. So just trying to sense, can I find those places where the third hierarchy might be working in acts of destiny that I seem to encounter in my year? And can I see the consequences of my deeds? And can I sense the working of the second hierarchy there? And then what really are the things that I have created that have substance that works into the world that then would be as food and nourishment for the first hierarchy? And is it possible for me to find that as I go through the year review at this time of year? Okay, so I want to
just give you a little time warning, Mary, but this is amazing. Thank you.
I'm right at the end right now.
Great, perfect.
So I just want to point to what's happening in the sky right now. So tonight it's the 27th, so you can see the crescent moon. So the moon was just new for us in the midnight hour of the 26th, from the 25th to the 26th. It actually caused an annular eclipse over the Arabian Peninsula. And now we're just starting to see the beginning of the crescent. And tomorrow evening on the 28th, the moon is going to be a beautiful crescent it's going to look like Venus is sitting right in that crescent. And if you really want to read about the mystery of that kind of a crescent moon, I recommend Rudolf Steiner's lecture on Christ in the Spiritual World, the quest for the Holy Grail. And he describes there quite beautifully that crescent moon and the mystery of finding Parzival, and where the name of the one who will become the Grail King, where you can find that, and how that's rooted in that crescent moon. And particularly because Venus, as goddess of love and beauty, is right there kind of being held in the chalice of that moon. So by far the biggest thing that's coming toward us next year is the great conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter that will happen at winter solstice in 2020. This conjunction will be happening in the tropical zodiac at the beginning of Aquarius, which is an air sign. And these conjunctions, because they only happen every 20 years, they will happen 1/3 of the way through the zodiac, and it ends up that for about 200 years they happen in the same element of the zodiac. So all the conjunctions will be in air signs for 200 years, and then they'll move into the earth signs, then they'll move into the water signs, then they'll move into the fire signs, then it's back to the air signs. So it's been 800 years since the conjunctions were happening in air signs, and that was when Dante wrote his Divine Comedy. So Dante wasn't just stuck in there because I have a crush on him lately, but because it really matters to what's going on in the cycle of time right now. And then at the beginning of the year, so just in a few days, the moon is going to be full, the moon that was just new, the moon that we're going to be watching tomorrow night with Venus, ideally. It's going to come full on January 10th, just after Mercury meets the sun. Now, Mercury is significant in the foundation, laying of the foundation stone, because this is what Rudolf Steiner calls to witness the laying of the foundation stone, the laying of the microcosm into the macrocosm, which indicates that we're crossing a threshold. And you always have an escort for that threshold crossing. Mercury just transited the sun on November 11th, and this is its first meeting with the sun since that time on January 10th. And then right after that, Uranus is going to go direct, then Mercury is going to move on, meet Saturn, meet Pluto. Saturn's going to meet Pluto, then the sun is going to sweep over all of them. This is a pretty intense lineup of planetary energy. If you look into the world of astrology, you're going to find a lot of stuff about this, but it's really a setup for the conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter that's coming at the end of the year. Okay, I think that's the end of my slides. Just want to give a little plug a big plug actually, for a wonderful event that we'll be hosting out in New Mexico at Spring Equinox. This is specifically about the great conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter and its relationship to the being of Anthroposophia. And I want to end with this poem from Rilke, which I think is a wonderful way to imagine not only Gemini and this duality that seems to be represented by the twins, but also the opposition of Gemini with Sagittarius, and this thinking across the threshold of wakefulness and sleeping, or between the spiritual celestial world and the earthly world, and how the human being stands as a mediator between these worlds. Slowly, the west reaches for clothes of new colors, which it passes to a row of ancient trees. You look, and soon these two worlds both leave you. One part climbs toward heaven, one sinks to earth, leaving you, not really belonging to either, not so hopelessly dark as that house that is silent, not so unswervingly given to the eternal as that thing that turns to a star each night and climbs. Leaving you, it is impossible to untangle the threads. Your own life, timid and standing high and growing, so that sometimes blocked in, sometimes reaching out. One moment, your life is a stone in you, and the next, a star. All right. That last slide was by request, so that you could get in touch with me if you have questions about any of this information that I shared. It was a lot of information to cram in there, but also about observing the holy nights, the path that I'm taking from Virgo, going in review from Virgo back across the holy nights in the new year, the 3 Eves, anything that you would like to chat about. So, okay.